Tonight, I want to take you into a story that has haunted maps, swallowed fortunes, and pulled people into forests so dense the sky disappears. It's a story that begins with gold but never ends with it. Because El Dorado is not just a place. El Dorado is a hunger that turned rivers into rumors, mountains into mirages, and entire continents into a stage for obsession. For nearly 500 years, people have chased El Dorado, the Golden One, the Golden City, the Golden Kingdom, searching for something that might never have existed in the form they imagined. Some died looking for it. Some went mad. Some returned with nothing but fever scars and stories. And some returned with stories so vivid they created new myths that still echo today. Over the next hour and a bit, we're going to tell the El Dorado saga as one complete voiceover-ready narrative. We'll start with the real origin of the legend, an indigenous ritual high in the Andes, where gold was not a currency of conquest, but a language of the sacred. We'll follow the Spanish invasion as it collides with rumor and fear, and watch how a story about one gilded man mutates into a rumor about an entire golden empire. We'll trace the great expeditions into the Amazon and Orinoco basins, where men vanished into green infinity and returned with maps that were half truth and half hallucination. We'll meet famous seekers like Gonzalo Pizarro, Francisco de Orellana, and the nightmare figure of Lope de Aguirre. We'll step into the propaganda war of Sir Walter Raleigh, who used El Dorado as a political weapon in Europe. And finally, we'll watch myth meet measurement as maps tighten. But I want to be clear about something before we begin. This story contains wonder, but it also contains violence. El Dorado is entangled with conquest, slavery, forced labor, and the destruction of indigenous worlds. We are not here to romanticize that suffering. We are here to understand how a ritual became a rumor became an empire on paper, and an empire on paper sent real people to their deaths. And keep one question in the back of your mind the entire time. If the Golden City never existed, why did so many intelligent people keep believing it did? Chapter 1. The Gilded Man. El Dorado did not begin as a city. It began as a person. In the highlands of what is now Colombia, the Muisca people lived in a world of cold lakes, steep mountains, and sacred waters. Gold existed there, not as endless bullion, but as crafted offerings, ornaments, and symbols. And one ritual, recorded after the Spanish arrived, became the spark that ignited the El Dorado wildfire. According to those accounts, when a new leader, often called the Zipa, the ruler in the southern part of the Muisca territory, took power, a ceremony took place at a sacred lake. The leader's body would be coated with sticky resin and then dusted with fine gold until he gleamed. Not like a statue, like a living sun, a gilded man. He would step onto a raft and move toward the center of the lake, surrounded by attendants, incense, chants, and offerings. And then, in a moment of stillness, gold and treasures would be cast into the water. Gifts to the gods, not payments to an army. This is the root of the name. El Dorado literally means the Gilded One, a person, not a place. And that distinction matters, because it tells you the story's first crime. The legend begins with translation, not just of language, but of values. In the Muisca worldview, gold could be sacred because its purpose was symbolic. It was not necessarily the ultimate measure of wealth. Other things mattered: land, alliances, salt, textiles, food security, the stability of seasons. But when Spaniards heard gold, they heard only one meaning: power. And power to an invader is never a symbol. It's a target. Now imagine what happens when a story like that reaches conquistadors: a man covered in gold, a lake filled with offerings, a society that treats gold as something you can throw away. To Europeans arriving from a world where gold meant wages, crowns, and cannon, this did not sound like religion. It sounded like a mistake waiting to be corrected. They didn't think, how beautiful. They thought, how much? They assumed the lake was a bank. They assumed the ritual was a clue. They assumed the offerings proved a source. And if the offerings proved a source, then somewhere nearby there must be mines, vaults, stockpiles, an entire hidden economy of gold. That assumption is the seed of El Dorado's mutation, because the ritual is real. But the European interpretation of what the ritual implies is not. Here is the first open loop we need to plant. If El Dorado began as a ritual at a lake, why did it become a city in the jungle? How did one gilded man become a golden empire? The answer is not a single moment. It's a chain reaction. And the first link is conquest. Chapter 2. Conquest meets rumor. When Spanish expeditions pushed into the northern Andes in the 1530s, they were riding a wave of recent history. They had already seen the unimaginable. They had toppled wealthy empires. They had watched rooms fill with ransom gold. So when they heard rumors of rich highland peoples beyond the mountains, they believed those rumors would lead to another empire. Not because the rumor was precise, but because their experience had taught them a dangerous lesson. Somewhere out there, there is always another pile of treasure. Spanish campaigns and rival expeditions converged on the highlands where the Muisca lived. Conquest moved faster than understanding. And once the Spanish arrived, they did what conquerors always do first. They demanded tribute. They demanded captives. They demanded information. They asked the same question in 100 ways. Where is it coming from? Where is the rest? And in that pressure cooker, stories become unstable. People answer in ways that protect themselves. People point away from their homes. People feed conquerors the direction they want to hear. Farther, deeper, not here. Sometimes those answers are deliberate misdirection. Sometimes they're misunderstandings that grow. Sometimes they're true details ripped out of context and weaponized. Because under occupation, every sentence is spoken with a blade nearby. Now, the Spanish weren't one unified machine. They were a chaotic blend of ambition, rivalries, debts, and hunger. Different leaders competed. Different parties raced for prestige, and competition is gasoline for rumor. If your rival claims there's a golden kingdom farther east, you can't afford to be the one who stayed behind. You chase, even if chasing kills you. This is how El Dorado becomes inevitable. Not because it is true, but because the incentives of conquest demand that it might be. One of the most important things to understand about this phase is that the Spanish were not chasing pure fantasy. They were chasing patterns they had already seen. They had seen wealthy states. They had seen tribute systems. They had seen roads, storehouses, and organized power. So when they encountered the Muisca, a complex society but not an empire of the scale they imagined, they forced the Muisca into the mold of what they expected. They assumed a king must have a treasury. They assumed a treasury must be large. They assumed the large treasury must mean more, somewhere else, and every assumption pushed the myth farther away from its origin. Then the lake enters the story. Lake Guatavita, often linked to the Gilded Man ritual, became an obsession. The logic was seductive. If offerings were thrown into the water for generations, then the lake must be full of treasure. So people tried to drain it. They cut channels into the rim. They lowered the water level. They clawed at the mud. And at times they did recover objects, not the infinite hoard of fantasy, but real artifacts that proved something important. The ritual wasn't invented. The offerings were real, which is exactly the kind of partial truth that fuels a larger lie. Because once you pull one piece of gold from a lake, your imagination can pull 1,000. And once the imagination is convinced, the lake becomes more than a lake. It becomes a vault that must be emptied. Here's the cruel irony. The more the Spanish failed to extract an empire-sized fortune from Guatavita, the more they interpreted the failure as proof that the real treasure must be hidden elsewhere. Because conquest minds rarely say, "We were wrong." They say, "We were close." Now, this is the precise moment the myth changes shape. El Dorado is no longer just a gilded man. It becomes a promise of accumulation. A storehouse, a city, a kingdom. Not because anyone saw that city, but because greed needed a bigger container for its belief. And belief always expands to match desire. Reset point. What we know so far. So far, we have two realities. 1, there was a real ritual in which a leader was gilded and offerings were made. 2, conquest turned that ritual into a treasure target. Now, the key transformation is about to happen. Because once the Spanish learned that the highlands were rich but not infinite, they did what obsessive minds always do. They moved the goalpost. They took the name El Dorado and attached it to a new object, a place they had not seen. A city in the interior, a kingdom beyond the next mountain range, a dream that could never be fully disproven. And now the story runs. Chapter 2. 3 Men, 1 Rumor. There's an episode in the early El Dorado story that feels almost cinematic, because it shows how competition can turn a rumor into destiny. Picture 3 separate expeditions pushing through difficult terrain, each led by men who want the same thing: credit. Each man wants to be the first to claim a rich new kingdom for the crown. Each man wants the titles, the land grants, the privileges. And each man understands one brutal truth. If someone else finds the treasure first, you become an asterisk. In the northern Andes, rival leaders converged on the same highland region from different directions, arriving with different stories and different expectations. This convergence mattered because it amplified the rumor. If 3 leaders hear some version of a ruler covered in gold, then surely it must be real. If 3 leaders are racing, then surely they must not stop until they hit the finish line. And in an environment where the finish line is imaginary, the race has no natural end. Competition turns uncertainty into urgency. Urgency turns bad information into truth. And truth turns into orders that people must obey. This is how myths become bureaucratic, because the crown in Spain and the investors in Europe didn't hear the chaos on the ground. They received letters, reports, claims, and those documents were written in a specific style. Not the style of doubt, the style of certainty. A leader would say, "We are close." He would say, "The land is rich." He would say, "The people speak of a greater kingdom farther east." Then he would request more supplies, more soldiers, more horses. And his rivals would write the same thing. Because writing "we found nothing" is the same as writing "I failed." So the reports become a chorus. Different voices, same song. A song about proximity. A song about almost. And the word almost becomes the engine that keeps the myth running. Now, consider what this does to interpretation. A single story about a gilded ceremony becomes proof that a massive empire exists. A single recovered object becomes proof that a vault is waiting. A single frightened answer from a captive becomes proof of a city beyond the horizon. And every new proof creates the expectation of a bigger proof. That is how a rumor grows teeth. By the time El Dorado becomes common knowledge in Europe, it no longer needs first-hand witnesses. It has momentum. It has paperwork. It has prestige. And the people chasing it can no longer admit it might be wrong, because too many careers are built on the assumption that it's right. This is one of the strangest forces in history. Once a belief becomes a system, the system protects the belief. Not because it is true, because it is useful. And now we return to the lake, because nothing shows the collision between myth and reality more clearly than a body of water people tried to turn into a bank account. Chapter 2c, the lake that would not empty. Lake Guatavita is more than a location. It's a symbol, because it represents the exact point where a sacred act was misread as a financial opportunity. The lake sits in the highlands, a dark circle of water in a crater-like basin. To the Muisca, it was a place of meaning. To the Spanish, it became a container. And containers invite a certain kind of thinking. If treasure goes in, treasure can come out. If enough treasure went in, there must be a fortune at the bottom. So people tried again and again to take it. They cut channels through earth. They lowered the waterline. They pulled mud. They searched the exposed shoreline like desperate gamblers searching a carpet for dropped coins. Sometimes they found objects. Sometimes the objects were spectacular enough to restart the obsession. Sometimes the finds were small enough to create a new theory. The real hoard must be deeper. But the lake resisted, not with magic, with physics, with the sheer difficulty of draining water from a crater, and with the reality that the ritual was not a single dump of treasure. It was offerings over time in a religious context. The lake was not a vault built to store wealth. It was a sacred site where objects were given away. That difference changes everything. Because it means there was never going to be one moment where someone opens a chest and becomes rich. There was only going to be slow damage, slow extraction, slow theft, and the kind of disappointment that forces the myth to mutate. Here's what the lake also reveals. El Dorado is one of the clearest examples of how evidence can be used incorrectly. A single recovered artifact proves that offerings happened. It does not prove an empire of gold. But the human mind loves to scale up. If there was one, there must be many. If there were many, there must be a source. If there is a source, there must be a city. And once the mind builds the city, it starts searching for it. That chain reaction is the most dangerous mechanism in the El Dorado story, because it turns a real cultural practice into a justification for endless invasion. Now, imagine a conquistador hearing that the lake did not deliver the fortune he expected. What does he conclude? Does he conclude that the story was misunderstood? Usually no. He concludes that someone is hiding the truth. He concludes that the treasure was moved. He concludes that the real El Dorado is elsewhere. This is how the myth survives contact with reality. Reality says no. The myth says not here, and not here points to the jungle. So now we follow it, downriver into the green. Chapter 3. The myth learns to run. When the Muisca did not produce an empire-sized hoard, the myth did not die. It migrated. Because El Dorado was never a coordinate. It was a story engine. It could move without breaking. And the perfect place for it to move was the unknown interior, the rainforest, the rivers, the unmapped. If you can't disprove the myth, you can always relocate it. So the legend begins to drift. The Golden Kingdom is no longer in the highlands. It is somewhere beyond, somewhere east, somewhere downriver, somewhere only the desperate will follow. This is where geography becomes a character. Because South America's interior is not a blank canvas. It is a living system with its own rules, its own dangers, its own rhythms. In the tropics, rivers are both highways and traps. A river can carry you toward food and transport, but it can also carry you deeper into the unknown, away from return routes, into fever country, into endless green. Expeditions relied on rivers because the jungle made land travel brutal. But rivers had their own tricks. Floods erased paths. Currents split. Mist hid side channels. A wrong turn could cost weeks. A wrong season could cost lives. And that means a rumor is not just a rumor. In the Amazon basin, a rumor is a plan for survival. Because you are not only navigating water, you are navigating exhaustion. Here's a detail that often gets lost in modern retellings. Most of these expeditions were not sleek teams of explorers. They were moving disasters. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of people. Soldiers, guides, coerced laborers, porters, interpreters, captives. Animals that could die at any time. Supplies that rot in heat. Weapons that rust. And one thin thread of hope holding it all together. The belief that a golden city is still ahead. This is where we meet Gonzalo Pizarro. The name Pizarro already carried weight. In the European imagination, it was a synonym for conquest. In the jungle, it became a synonym for obsession. Pizarro led an expedition east from the Andes in search of wealth, sometimes described as cinnamon, sometimes as a golden country. And as his group pushed deeper, the myth of El Dorado traveled with them like a second shadow. They built boats where there should have been no boats. They cut timber in places where every swing of an axe attracted insects and infection. They ate what they could find. They lost what they couldn't protect. The jungle did what the jungle always does. It ate resources. Food ran out. Animals vanished. Horses died. Iron rusted. Boots rotted. Men who thought themselves invincible began to hallucinate. They ate leather. They boiled belts. They drank water that made them weaker. And still they moved. Because the myth promised that the suffering was temporary and the reward was permanent. That is the addiction at the heart of El Dorado. At a critical moment, Francisco de Orellana, originally part of the group, took a party downriver to find food and supplies. In many versions of the story, that decision becomes a point of no return. The current was too strong, the distance too vast. They couldn't come back, so Orellana kept going. And the river kept unfolding, a river so wide it looked like an ocean, a river that turned into the spine of a new myth. Because Orellana's journey produced something Europe craved even more than gold, a narrative of immensity. If the river was that vast, then surely the interior held civilizations worthy of an empire. Some accounts described large communities along the banks. Trade, agriculture, organization. Other accounts described scarcity and fear. Either way, the reports were enough. Because if there were structured societies deeper in the interior, then maybe the Golden Kingdom was real after all. Maybe it was simply farther away. Do you see how the myth survives? If you fail, it's not because the myth is false. It's because you didn't go far enough. And far enough in the Amazon is a bottomless word. Now, store that idea, because the next phase of the legend is where far enough becomes madness. Chapter 3b. Why almost is more powerful than found. There is a strange rule in treasure myths. A complete victory ends the story, but a near miss keeps it alive. If someone truly found El Dorado, with evidence so undeniable it ended debate, the legend would collapse into history. It would become a museum exhibit and a textbook paragraph. But almost is infinite. Almost means tomorrow. Almost means the next expedition. Almost means your failure is not proof of falsehood. It's proof of proximity. And proximity is how you raise money, recruit followers, and justify risk. This is why explorers wrote with certainty even when they had little. This is why accounts grew more dramatic as conditions grew worse. Because almost is the only thing that can make suffering feel purposeful. And when you combine almost with the jungle, a place that can hide the truth for centuries, you create a myth that can outlive anyone. Now, to see that myth at its darkest, we have to meet the expedition that turned El Dorado into a nightmare. Chapter 3c. The Amazon Rumor Machine. To understand why El Dorado thrived in the Amazon and Orinoco basins, you have to understand the nature of information in the jungle. Information is scarce, visibility is limited, distances are deceptive, and survival depends on trust. But trust is constantly under pressure. You rely on guides, but guides may be coerced. You rely on interpreters, but interpreters may misunderstand or protect their own people, or say what the invader wants to hear to end the interrogation. You rely on indigenous networks, but you don't understand the politics inside those networks. So you misread. And misreading in the jungle doesn't just create mistakes. It creates myths. Because the jungle is perfect at hiding correction. If someone claims they saw a city beyond the next river, how do you disprove it? You can spend months trying. You can spend years. You can die before you reach the place where disproof becomes possible. The landscape absorbs error. And while the landscape absorbs error, the story travels. Now think about trade. Many indigenous communities had trade routes and exchange systems. A group near the foothills might have a piece of gold acquired through exchange from somewhere else. To a Spaniard, that piece of gold looks like a sign of a nearby mine. But to the people holding it, it may be a sign of relationship, a symbol of alliance, a token of trade. So when Spaniards asked, "Where did you get this?" and they were told, "From the east," they translated east into mine. They translated mine into city. They translated city into empire. And then they built an expedition around that translation. This is how El Dorado uses real human networks to build imaginary geography. In some accounts, explorers also described large settlements along rivers, sometimes with agriculture and dense populations. Modern research suggests that parts of the Amazon region did support complex societies and managed landscapes, but that complexity is not the same as a golden metropolis. The tragedy is that Europeans could have learned something real about the region. Instead, they filtered everything through one question: where is the gold? So even when they encountered evidence of human engineering, agriculture, and culture, they treated it as a clue to loot, not as a world to understand. And when the looting did not appear, they dismissed the reality and kept chasing the fantasy. This is why El Dorado is also a story about lost opportunities. Opportunities to see another way of living. Opportunities to understand the Amazon on its own terms. Those opportunities were crushed under the weight of a myth. Now add disease. In tropical expeditions, illness changes perception. Fever makes dreams feel like memories. Exhaustion makes shadows feel like movement. Hunger makes any promise sound true. So when a starving soldier hears, "There is a rich land farther downriver," he doesn't evaluate it like a scientist. He clings to it like a rope. And in that emotional state, exaggeration is not a lie. It's a coping mechanism. That is why expedition accounts often read like they are balancing on the edge between observation and hallucination. Because in the jungle, that edge is thin. Now remember our earlier idea. Almost is more powerful than found. In the Amazon, almost can last forever. And that forever is where El Dorado feeds. Chapter 4. The Expedition That Became a Nightmare. By the 1560s, El Dorado had evolved again. The story was now tied to the idea of a hidden kingdom somewhere in the interior, sometimes called Manoa, sometimes associated with a vast lake, sometimes described as a city that glittered with gold. With every retelling, the kingdom became more organized, more imperial, more European in its logic, which should already tell you something. When Europeans imagined El Dorado, they imagined it as a mirror of what they valued: hierarchy, riches, palaces, conquest. The myth was colonizing the imagination before it colonized the land. Now we meet Pedro de Ursua and Lope de Aguirre. Ursua led an expedition downriver, searching for El Dorado. He carried authority, plans, discipline. But discipline is fragile when you are starving, sick, and surrounded by endless forest. Aguirre was a soldier with a reputation for violence and volatility. In some accounts, he was already a walking wound, resentful, ambitious, brutal, convinced the world owed him something it refused to pay. Put that kind of person into a floating camp of exhaustion and hunger, and you do not get discovery. You get collapse. The expedition descended into betrayal, mutiny, executions, paranoia. Aguirre turned the quest into a moving tyranny. He demanded loyalty like oxygen. He punished hesitation like treason. He turned suspicion into policy, and the river kept carrying them forward, whether they wanted it or not. This is where El Dorado stops being a treasure story and becomes a horror story, because it reveals what obsession does when it is armed. In the myth, the jungle is a backdrop. In reality, it is a force that breaks people. Disease, insects, heat, hunger, and fear stripped away civilized masks. And when the masks fell, violence filled the void. Here's what makes this chapter so haunting. Aguirre's rebellion, his cruelty, his infamous letters, these details vary in retelling, but the pattern is consistent. El Dorado becomes the justification for anything. Any theft becomes necessary. Any murder becomes discipline. Any cruelty becomes the price of greatness. That is how myths become engines of harm. Not because myths swing swords, because people swing swords while holding myths as excuses. And notice how El Dorado functions in this nightmare. It is always just ahead. It is always almost within reach. It is always the reason to endure one more day of misery. So, even as the expedition disintegrates, the myth remains intact. In fact, it becomes stronger, because survivors return with the most valuable currency of all. A story about madness in the green. A story about betrayal in a world of water. A story about how close they were. And stories like that are unforgettable. They spread faster than facts. Now, here is the open loop we carry forward into the next chapter. If El Dorado can survive even an expedition that collapses into horror, what could possibly kill it? The answer is unsettling. Nothing can kill it as long as it remains useful. And in Europe, El Dorado was useful. It was useful for politics, useful for propaganda, useful for rivalry. So now we leave the river for a moment and step into royal courts and printed books where El Dorado becomes a weapon. Chapter 4b. The legend gains a new power. A rumor in the jungle is dangerous, but a rumor printed in a book is immortal. Once El Dorado entered European print culture, it gained a new advantage. It could reach people who would never smell the jungle, people who would never see the river, people who would never bury their friends in mud. And those people, kings, ministers, investors, were the ones who could fund the next wave. So the legend didn't just survive the jungle, it learned to recruit Europe. Chapter 4c. How the Nightmare Ends. Most treasure legends end with either triumph or mystery. The Aguirre story ends with consequence. Eventually, the moving tyranny collapses. Not because someone finds El Dorado, but because violence consumes itself. A regime built on fear must keep escalating fear. A leader who rules by suspicion must keep inventing enemies. And the moment his followers believe they are safer without him, the story ends. In retellings, Aguirre's end is grim and fitting. He becomes trapped by the same forces he unleashed. He is hunted. He is cornered. He is betrayed. And the myth that powered the expedition, the myth that promised gold beyond the horizon, offers no rescue. That's the hidden lesson of this chapter. El Dorado can justify suffering. It can justify cruelty. But it does not pay back. It doesn't reward loyalty. It doesn't protect the believer. The myth is not a god. It is a mirror. And in Aguirre's mirror, you see what obsession looks like when it is stripped of romance. Now, as horrific as this chapter is, it still does not end the legend. Because Europe didn't only absorb the warning, it absorbed the drama. It absorbed the spectacle. And spectacle spreads. So the nightmare chapter becomes, in a twisted way, another marketing tool. Another proof that something huge is at stake. Because people don't risk this much for nothing, right? That question, that flawed logic, is exactly how El Dorado keeps recruiting new believers. And now the legend's greatest recruiter steps forward. A man whose words will build a golden city on paper so convincing that map makers will draw it for generations. Sir Walter Raleigh. Chapter 5. Raleigh, Guyana, and the Politics of a Mirage. Spain's American wealth changed European power. It funded wars. It bought alliances. It built fleets. And rival nations looked at that gold and saw not just envy, but strategy. If Spain had a golden empire, England wanted a golden empire too. This is where Sir Walter Raleigh enters the legend. Raleigh was not only chasing treasure, he was chasing leverage. In his world, El Dorado was a counterweight, a way to challenge Spain, a way to claim that England's future could be built on a discovery that would eclipse everything Spain had taken. Raleigh's story was shaped by rivalry. It was shaped by the politics of the Elizabethan era, by court intrigue, by ambition, by the need to impress, and by the fear of being forgotten. He traveled to the region associated with the Orinoco and Guyana, collecting rumors, negotiating, interpreting, and sometimes shaping what he heard into what he needed. He met local leaders and heard stories of a wealthy interior, stories that, in their original context, may have referred to trade, power, or distant places. But Raleigh's audience in Europe did not want nuance. They wanted a destination. They wanted a golden empire with a name. So Raleigh's accounts described a magnificent interior kingdom, often tied to the name Manoa and to a vast lake sometimes called Paraim. The descriptions were vivid, the confidence was high, and the impact was immediate. Because paper can do what expeditions cannot. Paper can carry a city farther than a river ever will. Now, here is the key to Raleigh's influence. He didn't need to produce gold. He needed to produce plausibility. He needed a story that felt specific enough to be believed, but distant enough that failure could be blamed on bad timing, bad guides, bad luck. And he needed to wrap it in national destiny. That's the upgrade. El Dorado goes from myth to propaganda. From "I heard a rumor" to "this is England's future." But reality is stubborn. Later attempts did not deliver a golden city that could be claimed, looted, or displayed. Costs mounted. Enemies watched. The political winds shifted. In the end, the legend outlived the man. Yet Raleigh's writing had already done the job. It had stamped El Dorado onto the European imagination with a new set of coordinates. Not the Andean lake, but the interior of Guyana. And once the legend was printed, it became portable. Other writers could copy it. Other map makers could draw it. Other seekers could chase it. And this is why the El Dorado story is so hard to kill. It is not pinned to a single origin. It is a migrating target, carried by whoever needs it. Now, let's make a subtle point that changes how you see everything that comes next. Raleigh's El Dorado was not just a treasure rumor. It was an investment pitch. It had a narrative structure designed to open wallets. You present a vast prize. You emphasize that your rivals are close. You suggest that hesitation equals losing history. You surround uncertainty with confidence. And you end with a promise: support me, and you will share in the reward. That is not unique to the 1500s. That is the skeleton of countless schemes in every era. El Dorado is one of the oldest examples of this pattern. A myth that can raise money. And once a myth can raise money, it becomes almost indestructible. Reset point. What the Raleigh chapter proves. If you're keeping track, Raleigh's chapter proves something vital. The legend does not survive because people keep finding evidence. It survives because people keep finding reasons. Political reasons, economic reasons, psychological reasons. And now, in the next chapter, we're going to see the strangest reason of all. El Dorado survives because maps made it look real. And when a map says a lake exists, people treat the lake like a fact, even when it isn't. Chapter 5b, the book that built a city. Raleigh's most enduring expedition was not the one he sailed. It was the one he wrote. Because a written account can do something physical travel cannot. It can compress distance. It can smooth contradictions. It can turn a messy, ambiguous, half-understood set of conversations into a clean narrative arc. And that is what Raleigh's writing offered. A golden empire with a name, a route with landmarks, a sense that England could arrive and claim what Spain had missed. Now, even if you assume Raleigh believed at least part of what he wrote, the structure still matters. He presents the interior as rich. He emphasizes that rivals are competing. He frames delay as danger, and he implies that the prize is not only gold, it is history, it is glory. It is the right to say, we did what no one else could do. That is powerful. Because it means you can sell El Dorado to people who don't even care about money. You can sell it to people who care about legacy. And in a world of nobles and monarchs, legacy is priceless. So Raleigh's narrative becomes a kind of spell. It doesn't need to be fully true. It needs to be true enough to keep the engine running. And it succeeds. For a long time, El Dorado is not just a rumor among soldiers. It's a concept in European strategy, a target on the mental map of empire, a justification for exploration that can be framed as discovery rather than invasion. But the book also creates a trap. Because once you describe a city with confidence, people will look for it with confidence. And when they fail, they won't doubt the book. They will doubt the timing, or the guides, or themselves. Or they will conclude the city is hidden. And hidden cities are irresistible. A city you can't find becomes a city you can keep chasing. That is the paradox Raleigh hands to the future. He strengthens the myth by making it concrete. And by making it concrete, he gives it infinite life. Now, how do you kill a city that lives on paper? You would think you kill it by mapping the land accurately, by measuring, by proving the lake isn't there. But the next chapter is where you learn the most frustrating truth of all. Even when the map tightens, the myth finds a new place to hide. It hides inside the way maps are copied. Chapter 6. When a map invents a place. For modern viewers, it's easy to forget how powerful a map once was. A printed map was not a suggestion. It was authority. It carried the prestige of science, exploration, and empire. So when cartographers drew a feature, a lake, a city, a mountain range, that feature became true for anyone who had not seen the land. And El Dorado exploited that. Or rather, believers exploited that. Because if you could place the legend on a map, you turned a rumor into a destination. One of the most famous examples is the Phantom Lake, often labeled Paraime. For generations, this lake appeared on maps of northern South America. Sometimes it was enormous, sometimes it shifted. Sometimes the golden city of Manoa hovered on its shore like a promise. The lake's presence on a map created a feedback loop. Explorers saw it and went looking. Their reports, even when uncertain, were interpreted as confirmation. Cartographers copied each other. The feature survived. And the longer it survived, the more real it felt. This is one of the most important lessons of the El Dorado story. Errors can become tradition, and tradition can become truth. Now, was there ever any reason to think a large lake existed in that region? There are seasonal floods. There are vast wetlands. There are plains that can transform during heavy rains. A traveler moving through in one season might describe a sea of water. A traveler in another season might see grass and dry land. If you stitch those descriptions together without understanding the ecology, you can invent a permanent lake. And once that lake exists on paper, it becomes an anchor for myth. This is why some legends do not need a city to be real. They only need a feature that can be misread. A floodplain can become a lake. A lake can become a kingdom. A kingdom can become an empire. And then men die trying to find it. Here's what makes cartography so dangerous in the era of El Dorado. Once a map is published, it doesn't just reflect belief. It produces belief. A young officer sees the lake and thinks, it must exist. A merchant sees it and thinks, we could profit. A king sees it and thinks, we must claim it. A rival sees it and thinks, we cannot let them. The map turns uncertainty into urgency. It turns rumor into policy. And this is why the Phantom Lake endured. Not because it was always visible, because it was always useful. Over time, exploration and science began to tighten the net around El Dorado. As more of South America was mapped, the room for a hidden golden empire shrank. The Phantom Lake faded. The city drifted. But the legend did not die. It adapted. It became less about one precise place and more about the idea that somewhere, in the vastness, there must be a secret. And secrets are the one thing the jungle is good at protecting. Chapter 6b. The moment science starts to win. When scientific expeditions and more systematic mapping reached the region, they confronted a truth that myths hate. Reality has seasons. A place can be a lake one month and dry land the next. A river can look like an ocean after rain and look like a narrow channel in drought. If you arrive at the wrong time, the landscape itself lies to you. Once explorers began to understand seasonal patterns, the permanent Phantom Lake became harder to defend. Not impossible to claim. Myths can always find excuses, but harder. And each time the map tightened, El Dorado shifted again. From there is a city here to there is a city somewhere. From follow this route to decode this hint. From we can prove it to they are hiding it. The legend evolves to avoid falsification. That is why it survives centuries. Now we need to talk about the final transformation. Because as the myth becomes harder to defend geographically, it becomes stronger psychologically. It stops being a place and becomes a mirror. And that is where its true power lives. Chapter 6c. How a cartographic ghost survives. To understand the persistence of Lake Parime and the mapped Golden City, you have to understand the culture of map-making in early modern Europe. Map-makers were not always explorers. Many were compilers. They gathered reports, compared accounts, and built maps from second-hand information. And second-hand information is fragile. A traveler exaggerates a floodplain. A translator turns seasonal water into lake. A draftsman draws the outline. A publisher prints it. Another mapmaker copies it. And after enough copying, the feature stops being a guess. It becomes tradition. This is how a ghost becomes common knowledge. The copying also creates an illusion of consensus. If 10 different maps show the same lake, people assume 10 independent sources confirmed it. But often those 10 maps are descendants of one mistake, one ancestor error. And that error gains authority simply by repetition. Now imagine being an explorer funded by a crown or a company. You are handed maps that show a lake. You are told to find it. You are told, implicitly, that the map is reality. So you go, and if you do not find the lake, you have a choice. You can report that the map was wrong, or you can report that you missed the lake. You can report that the lake is hidden, or that the season was wrong, or that local guides lied. Notice how easy it is to protect the map. Because if you say the map is wrong, you challenge authority. You challenge the people who funded you. You challenge the idea that the empire knows what it is doing. If you say, we were unlucky, you protect everyone. You protect the funders. You protect yourself. You protect the myth. So even disconfirmation can be translated into not yet. And not yet is exactly where El Dorado thrives. This is why scientific mapping matters, but it is not always enough. Because myths do not only live in geography, they live in incentives. And as long as incentives reward close, the map can keep its ghosts. Now, as the centuries move forward, the legend slowly shifts again. It becomes less a literal city and more a symbol of ultimate reward. And that symbol is powerful enough to survive in the modern mind, long after the Phantom Lake fades from serious charts. So let's end by looking at the myth's final hiding place. Not in a jungle, not on a map, inside us. Chapter 6. The scientists who walked into the legend. By the late 18th and 19th centuries, something began to change. The age of conquest slowly gave way to the age of measurement. Not because humans became less greedy, but because the world was becoming harder to lie about. More voyages, more surveys, more instruments, more people who cared about latitude and river courses, not just treasure. And when you step into the El Dorado story at this stage, the tone shifts. The old expeditions were powered by certainty. The new ones were powered by questions. One of the most important shifts was the rise of travelers who treated rumor as something to test, not something to obey. They listened, they observed, they compared, and they recorded contradictions instead of smoothing them away. In the interior of northern South America, these travelers encountered the same story again and again. A great lake, a rich city, an interior kingdom. But now, instead of drawing the lake on a map immediately, they asked a different set of questions. When does the water appear? Where does it go? What do local communities say when you ask them in different ways, at different times, in different places? Because myths often collapse under cross-examination. Not under one dramatic expedition. Under patient comparison. As more people traveled through the river systems and savanna regions, a pattern began to emerge. There were times when water spread across vast flatlands, creating the impression of a huge inland sea. There were also times when the same land was dry enough to walk. To someone arriving for the first time, the wet season could look like a permanent lake. To someone arriving later, the dry season could look like proof that the earlier traveler lied. Both could be honest. Both could be wrong in different ways. And that is exactly the kind of landscape that produces a cartographic ghost. A ghost lake. A lake that is real as an experience, but not real as a fixed feature. Now add the human element. When Europeans asked about a Great Lake, local answers could mean many things. A seasonal floodplain, a distant region, a metaphorical place, or a story told to satisfy outsiders who would not stop asking. Because after centuries of invasion, some communities learned that certain stories could redirect danger. If a dangerous group demands a destination, give them a destination that is far away. If they demand gold, tell them the gold is beyond the next river. You don't have to invent El Dorado to use it. You only have to know that the invader believes it. So in this phase, the legend becomes something else. Not only a myth Europeans chase, a tool indigenous communities sometimes use for survival. That doesn't mean every story was pure misdirection. But it means the information ecosystem is complicated. And once you acknowledge that complexity, the idea of a clean, literal golden city becomes harder and harder to defend. This is also the point where the legend's geography begins to shrink. The more rivers are traced, the more the blank spaces disappear. The more blank spaces disappear, the less room there is for a hidden metropolis that no one can prove. So El Dorado retreats into the last refuges of uncertainty. Remote wetlands, borderlands, places where colonial powers argue about who owns what. Places where maps are political, not just scientific. And in those political zones, a myth can survive longer. Because if a lake is convenient for a claim, it may remain on paper even after doubt grows. This is the final era of mapped El Dorado. Not the wild age of conquistadors, but the slow twilight of a legend being pressed into smaller and smaller corners until it becomes, at last, a metaphor. And metaphors don't need coordinates. They only need believers. Now with that in mind, we can finally step into the modern lens. Because the modern world did something the conquistadors could never do. It turned El Dorado into an idea that can travel without ships, without horses, without rivers at all. It travels through language, through brand names, through movies, through headlines, through our own private fantasies. And that is where we meet the last chapter of this story, the afterlife of a legend. Think about what a scientific traveler represented in that era. Not a conqueror seeking tribute, not a desperate soldier gambling his life, but a person carrying instruments, notebooks, and a mindset that treated nature as something to describe, not to dominate. That shift sounds small. It wasn't, because it changed what counted as success. For a conquistador, success was loot. For a surveyor, success was a reliable river course. For a naturalist, success was understanding how seasons reshape a landscape. And when those people began moving through the regions associated with El Dorado, the legend encountered a new enemy. Not swords, not arrows, boredom. The boredom of measurement, the patience of observation, the slow discipline that myths cannot charm. Some travelers recorded hearing about a great interior lake, but they also recorded something more important. They recorded how the story changed depending on who told it. Some told it as history. Some told it as rumor. Some told it as a place that existed far away, a phrase that can mean everything and nothing. Some told it the way you tell a child a bedtime myth, with confidence, because the point is not accuracy. The point is meaning. When a story functions like that, it cannot be pinned to a map, because it isn't a map story. It's a human story. This is also where the legend begins to collide with the reality of colonial borders. European powers argued about territory. They drew lines through landscapes they did not fully understand. They sent surveyors to justify claims. And in that environment, a phantom lake could become politically convenient. If a lake seemed to anchor a border, it could linger on paper longer than it deserved. If a city seemed to justify civilizing a region, it could appear as a rhetorical tool. So even as science advanced, politics could keep the ghost alive. But reality keeps pressing. When multiple expeditions cross the same region in different seasons, the picture sharpens. When travelers compare notes and notice that the lake appears only under certain conditions, the legend's physical anchor begins to dissolve. The lake becomes a floodplain. The sea becomes a seasonal mirror. and the Golden City becomes what it always really was, an idea. Now, here is the final twist in this chapter. As the legend loses its geographic certainty, it becomes easier to project onto it, because a vague legend can fit anything. If you want a city of gold, it can be a city of gold. If you want a spiritual metaphor, it can be that too. If you want a political excuse, it can become that. The less physical El Dorado becomes, the more powerful it becomes as symbol. That's why debunking doesn't always kill a myth. Sometimes debunking upgrades it. It frees it from the burden of proof. And once a myth is free from proof, it can travel forever. So when you hear people say, science killed El Dorado, the truth is more complicated. Science killed one version of El Dorado, the fixed city on a fixed lake. But it also revealed the deeper El Dorado, the human hunger that keeps inventing golden cities whenever the world feels uncertain. And that hunger is not something you can drain like a lake. You can only understand it, which brings us to the modern afterlife. Chapter 7. What El Dorado really reveals. At this point, it's tempting to treat El Dorado as a story about foolish explorers. But that's too easy, because the legend is not only about gullible seekers. It's about the machinery that turns desire into action. It's about what happens when systems reward obsession. El Dorado reflects the values of whoever looks into it. To the greedy, it promises profit. To the ambitious, it promises glory. To the desperate, it promises escape. To rulers, it promises national power. To historians, it reveals the blueprint of myth-making. To indigenous descendants, it carries memory, loss, and endurance. A legend can be false in its geography and still true in what it reveals about human nature. Here's the part that is hardest to say out loud. Even when explorers found gold, it rarely came without conflict. Gold was taken, not given. It came from raids, extortion, and forced tribute. The Golden Dream was built on violence from the beginning, which is why the legend has a dark undertone even when it is told as adventure. And the violence didn't only happen in battle. It happened in labor, in forced carrying, in displacement, in the slow erosion of a community's autonomy, as outsiders demanded that every landscape serve the myth. Some expeditions carried priests who interpreted the journey as a spiritual mission, while others carried gamblers who treated it like a high-stakes bet. In letters back to colonial authorities, expedition leaders often adopted a tone of certainty. They promised that the next bend in the river would reveal the city. They described themselves as being close, and noticed the pattern. Certainty grows as evidence shrinks. The farther the expedition goes, the more spectacular the claims become. Because spectacular claims are how you justify an expedition that has already consumed lives and money. The story also reveals how quickly Europeans replaced indigenous names with their own. Rivers, mountains, peoples. Everything was renamed as if naming were ownership. And once you rename, you erase. There were moments when explorers encountered prosperous indigenous settlements and assumed those settlements were the Golden City. Not because the settlements were golden, but because the explorers' minds were preloaded with a fantasy of wealth. Then, when the reality did not match the fantasy, the settlement was dismissed. Or worse, attacked. Every time a seeker wrote a dramatic account, they created a new version of El Dorado. Those versions competed with each other, merged and multiplied. If you think of El Dorado as a virus, then maps were its bloodstream. A single cartographic error could travel across Europe, appear in dozens of atlases, and become common knowledge. In the jungle, disease was a more reliable enemy than any warrior. Malaria, dysentery, infections, and parasites could break a body faster than arrows. Many people died without ever seeing a single artifact of gold. Some expeditions relied on coerced indigenous labor, whose suffering was rarely recorded in heroic narratives. The legend often frames the seekers as victims of jungle hardship, but the cost was carried by countless unnamed people. Porters, guides under pressure, communities caught in the path of violence. There is a reason El Dorado shifts toward the edge of the known world. Myths prefer margins. On the margin, the unknown protects the story from contradiction. El Dorado lived on the edge, because the edge is where reality is weakest. When the Phantom Lake disappeared from serious maps, it did not kill the legend. It revealed the legend's true nature. El Dorado was never one coordinate. It was a belief that wealth must exist somewhere beyond the horizon, waiting to solve the problems of the present. The most enduring treasure stories don't end with treasure. They end with a question. What would you do if you found it? Would you become generous, or would you become paranoid? Would it change your life, or would it change you into someone you don't recognize? El Dorado survives because it asks that question, and because every era answers it differently. Now we close the file with the only honest ending. Not a map, not a city. A lesson. Chapter 7b. The Psychology of the Golden City. Why does El Dorado still work on us? Why does the phrase "lost city of gold" still produce a pulse of excitement even when we know the history is soaked in suffering? Because El Dorado is built on a psychological mechanism older than empires. Variable reward. A slot machine doesn't hook you by paying out every time. It hooks you by paying out sometimes, just enough to keep you pulling the lever. El Dorado is the same machine. One expedition fails. Another brings back a gold trinket. One journey ends in disaster. Another returns with a dramatic story of being close. One map feature is disproven. Another map feature appears. The rewards are inconsistent, unpredictable, and therefore addictive. And the human brain is not built to ignore addictive uncertainty. Now add a second mechanism. Sunk cost. The more you have spent, the harder it is to stop. If you have marched for months, lost friends, burned supplies, and crossed rivers that tried to kill you, you cannot bear the idea that the goal was imaginary. So you reinterpret everything as proof you were close. You tell yourself the city moved. You tell yourself someone hit it. You tell yourself the next ridge will reveal it. This is how almost becomes sacred. Now add a third mechanism. Status. El Dorado is not only a treasure. It is a story you can own. If you are the one who finds it, you become immortal. Your name enters history. Your failure becomes irrelevant. So the legend offers a kind of spiritual reward even to people who claim they don't care about money. Glory, legacy. The right to say, I solved what others could not. And if you want to understand why modern treasure myths go viral, it's the same recipe. A massive prize, a mystery with gaps, a landscape that hides proof, a community that rewards belief. El Dorado is the prototype. And that means the real lesson of El Dorado is not only historical, it's contemporary. We still build golden cities in our minds. We still chase miracles. We still want an answer that will make our lives feel justified. That's why the legend doesn't die. Even when you remove the lake from the map, the hunger remains. So the question is not, where is El Dorado? The question is, what are you chasing that El Dorado represents? Because once you answer that, you can see the myth for what it is. Not a place, a mirror, and a warning. Chapter 8. When Myth Meets Measurement. In the 20th century, as archaeology matured, the focus shifted from looting to understanding. Sacred lakes became sites of meaning, not targets. Gold objects became cultural artifacts, not loot. And this shift, away from taking and toward learning, is the closest thing to an antidote the El Dorado story has ever had. Because the myth thrives on a single illusion, that the past is a treasure chest. But the past is not a chest. It is a graveyard, a library, a memory. When you treat it as a chest, you destroy it. Modern scholarship reframed the origin of El Dorado in a way that is both smaller and deeper. Smaller because it is not an empire of gold. Deeper because it reveals a worldview where gold was part of ritual, relationship, and cosmology. And when you understand that, you can see the central tragedy. A sacred ceremony became an excuse for conquest. A gift to the gods became a debt Europeans demanded to collect. A misunderstanding became policy. A word became an engine. Now, if you're wondering whether there was ever any treasure, the honest answer is complicated. There were offerings. There were objects. There were recoveries. There were also countless exaggerations. And because the legend became a marketplace, it attracted fraud. Fake maps, fake artifacts, invented journals, stories that grew each time they were sold. In other words, El Dorado didn't just create expeditions. It created an industry. And like any industry, it had incentives. You get paid for being close. You don't get paid for admitting you were wrong. So the story kept moving. It kept upgrading. It kept surviving. And now, in the modern era, it survives in a new form. Not as a destination for conquistadors, but as content. A thumbnail. A headline. A click. A promise that you can be the one who finally solves the mystery. But the mystery was never, where is the city? The mystery is, why do we want it to be there? Chapter 8b. The Afterlife of a Legend. Even if you never open a history book, you've probably met El Dorado. In a film title, in a song, in a video game, in a headline that promises a hidden fortune, in the name of a company that wants you to believe it has discovered something revolutionary. El Dorado became a metaphor for the ultimate payoff, a place where the world finally makes sense, a jackpot that solves the anxiety of uncertainty. And in a world that constantly manufactures uncertainty, that metaphor is extremely profitable. This is why El Dorado is still used as a lure. Because it's not only about gold, it's about the fantasy of certainty. The fantasy that if you find the right place, or the right secret, or the right breakthrough, your life will transform. That fantasy is ancient, but modern media industrialized it. Now, here's the ethical fork in the road. When a legend becomes entertainment, it can either become education or it can become erasure. If you tell El Dorado only as a treasure hunt, you erase the people whose lives were torn apart by that hunt. If you tell it only as a moral lecture, you risk losing the audience and turning the story into a scolding. The best path is the harder one. Tell the adventure, but keep the truth inside it. Keep the tension, but don't fake the facts. Keep the wonder, but don't hide the cost. Because the cost is part of the wonder's shadow. There is also a quieter modern afterlife that people rarely talk about. Looting, illegal digging, the black market for artifacts, the temptation to treat sacred objects as collectibles. The same misunderstanding updated with modern tools. Metal detectors instead of swords. Auction houses instead of conquistador camps. And the myth still whispers the same message. There is something valuable under the ground, and you deserve it. That whisper is not harmless. It is the voice of extraction. So the final question of El Dorado is not only did it exist, the final question is, what do we do with stories like this? Do we use them to fuel more hunger? Or do we use them to understand the hunger and step outside it? In a moment, we're going to close with two scenes, the ritual and the expedition, because those two images are the true beginning and the true ending of this legend. But before we do, I want you to hear this clearly. El Dorado is not a failure of exploration. It is a success of imagination. A success so powerful, it reshaped continents, rewrote maps, and survives in our language to this day. And that is why it matters. Look at how the phrase El Dorado is used today. People call a new gold rush an El Dorado. They call a booming industry an El Dorado. They call a sudden opportunity an El Dorado. The word no longer needs a jungle. It can be attached to any promise of abundance. And that tells you what the myth has always been about. Not a city, a shortcut. A fantasy that there is a single discovery that will erase all struggle. That fantasy is seductive because struggle is real. Life is heavy. Progress is slow. So a myth that offers instant transformation will always find an audience. This is why treasure myths are a permanent genre. Not because treasure always exists, because hope always exists. Now, as a storyteller, there's a responsibility here. The El Dorado story has cinematic elements. The raft on the lake, the glittering gold dust, the endless river, the lost men in the green. But it also has victims. And if you erase them, you repeat the original violence in a new form, narrative violence. So the goal is balance. You let the audience feel the pull of the mystery, but you keep them anchored to reality. You make the wonder honest. You make the cliffhangers true. You build suspense out of what is known, what is unknown, and what was believed, not out of fake certainty. Because the real suspense is already incredible. How did a ritual become an empire on paper? How did an empire on paper move armies? How did a city that was never confirmed become one of the most famous cities in history? That is the mystery, and it is more interesting than any fabricated secret map. There is another modern layer worth naming. The myth teaches us to value gold above meaning. But the objects connected to El Dorado, the crafted pieces, the ritual artifacts, the cultural knowledge, are valuable because they carry stories of real people. When those objects are treated as trophies, we lose context. We lose history. We lose the ability to understand the past as a human world rather than a treasure chest. That loss is irreversible. Gold can be melted and still be gold. But context, once destroyed, is gone forever. So when we tell El Dorado today, we have a choice. We can tell it like a slot machine. Endless spinning reels of maybe, almost, next time. Or we can tell it like a mirror, a story that helps us recognize hunger in ourselves. Now we're going to close with two scenes. The first is a gift. The second is a theft. And between them is the entire arc of the legend. Not just the history of a myth, the anatomy of desire. Final closing. Now, to close this story, I want you to imagine two scenes. The first is high in the Andes, a sacred lake under a cold sky, a raft gliding toward the center, a leader covered in gold dust, glittering like a living sun, attendants holding offerings, a moment of silence. Then the splash as gold disappears beneath dark water, not as theft, not as loss, but as a gift. The second scene is centuries later. A group of armed men hacking through jungle, starving, sick, convinced that somewhere ahead is a city that will justify everything. They never find it. But they keep walking because the myth has become stronger than reality. Between those two scenes is the entire El Dorado story. A ritual transformed into a rumor turned into a conquest plan turned into an expedition turned into a map turned into an obsession that outlived everyone who first believed it. El Dorado was never just a place. It was the name Europeans gave to a misunderstanding. And yet, in that misunderstanding, they revealed something timeless about human nature. We chase gold into darkness. We invent kingdoms to justify our hunger. We follow mirages until they become our history. And even when the golden city dissolves in the light of truth, the legend remains, because the legend was never really about a city. It was about desire. And desire, unlike cities, does not disappear. If you enjoyed this mystery, hit like and subscribe and turn on the bell. The next treasure hunt is already waiting, and you won't want to miss it.